Hello, everybody. This is part two of the immigration video clip. I'm just doing some overview points. You can see the ship that's coming into likely Ellis Island of Europeans, likely on an Atlantic liner. This is an image of Ellis Island, which opens around the time of 1890. So a lot of the time period that we've been talking about, whether it's populism or it's industrialization, increased immigration and so on, seems to kind of coalesce around this time period of 1890. Prior to Ellis Island and federal uh, counting of immigrants and a federal process for keeping track of immigrants to the United States. States may have done that. Castle Garden in Queens was a entrance point that had been the place where immigrants came into the United States if they crossed the Atlantic Ocean into areas like New York and New Jersey. You can see the way in which Ellis Island worked. Generally, this would apply to individuals who were traveling third class or steerage. This would be a process that people would go through often for a day, sometimes for more than a day if they were held for a particular reason. There were individuals who were working for Ellis Island who were checking individuals. So there might have been health checks, eye exams. Also, there could be markings on somebody. So there was a possibility for immigrants to be declined entrance to the United States. But more typically, immigrants are admitted to the United States through Ellis Island in the time period of the 1890s into 1900 and 1910. This is a massive peak of immigration. So Ellis Island isn't necessarily the tool where you have the most ruthless immigration restriction. Certainly, there do become restrictive laws that are based on national origin, and those are, the Chinese Exclusion Act and acts that come about in 1917, 1924. But at the time of Ellis Island, there's certainly ways in which discrimination and a great deal of forcing name changes and things like that definitely happen at Ellis Island, but it's not necessarily a place where the focus is to keep individuals out of the United States. It's really to have greater access to data about immigrants coming into the United States. Angel Island, on the other hand, does carry much more of a focus on stopping immigrants, in particular Asian immigrants, Chinese immigrants. So Angel Island could be a place where people may have been held for some time. If you looked at the Chinese Exclusion Act, there is a video about it on Schoology. Some of the things that we know there was a great deal of discrimination, in particular against Chinese men who had immigrated in really large numbers to the United States, and not just the United States, other societies too. We see Chinese immigration in Hawaii, we see Chinese immigration in Peru and in other places. These are individuals seeking work, and the Chinese Exclusion Act was specific to Chinese who were looking for contract labor. But we also have a variety of other immigrants who are coming to Angel Island. It might include Russians, for example. And, you also have Mexican immigrants who might be entering into the country at this time. But Angel Island was a place where people may have been held, people may have been deported. So it is sometimes referred to more as an immigration restriction usage, although there's also a lot of strategies that people use, like the Paper Sons, for example, the podcast that was on Schoology. So you have examples of ways in which people got creative to try to address some of the exclusionary laws. This is a kind of a piece of poetry. There was a time when parts of Ellis Island were going to be demolished, and there was a lot of discussion about it, and these were found. So they really do relate to some of the experiences of people who were held at Angel Island. We do have an uptick from the 1880s on very nativist federal legislation. There already was nativist state legislation, especially in the West Coast toward Chinese. There's a very, very specific type of targeted effect on many immigrants who are Chinese in places like California. Some of this includes school segregation, but a variety of different nativist laws. In 1882, we see the federal passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act. That's what it's called, and it's actually in place for about 10 years, and then it gets revoted to be in place for like another 10 years, and then after that it has to be like voted on again and again and again. So it is a consistent act that really tried to limit Chinese men who were going to be working, and some of this is because of massacres and discrimination that was occurring in the West Coast that focused particularly on the issue of lack of jobs. Remember, in 1873, there's a massive economic panic, so kind of connect some of the issues of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the scapegoating of Chinese immigrants to some of the challenges of the time with widespread speculation and the building of railroads, and then collapse of some of those industries and widespread loss of jobs by the 1870s, the late 1870s. I want to say the unemployment rate is like in the double digits, so it's pretty significant. By 1891, there's a great deal more language in legislation to describe undesirable immigrants. This uses particularly derogatory language, paupers, people who are likely to become federal charges, people who cannot afford to sustain themselves and become, dependent on the state, person suffering from a loathsome or dangerous disease. So that's kind of open-ended, right? It's not clear what that might be, but a variety of different diseases, start to fall into this category, and so that becomes a little bit subjective. We also see persons who have been convicted of a felony or other infamous crime or misdemeanor involving moral turpitude. There's a lot of questions about alcoholism, for example. Polygamists are going to be banned. So, how might an inspection agent at Ellis Island, know if somebody is a polygamist? But much of this is deriving from an increasing American perception that immigrants are coming as undesirables. This is a political cartoon that suggests the poorhouse from Galway just got placed, and this is in Ireland, got placed on a ship and is ultimately, coming to America. So this sense that from those of the social Darwinist perspective, that the kind of, gene pool, or in a sense, is becoming, concentrated with undesirables. There are very specific nativist organizations, the American Protective Association in the 1890s. It really is very much like an older political party. So these are not brand new views that are showing up, but kind of becoming trendy again. The American Protective Association is not widespread, but very anti-Catholic. That's what you want to know about the American Protective Association. Some of those folks really took issue with immigrants who, had Catholic leanings. The Immigration Restriction League, much more significant in the early 1900s. This is a group that has some academic roots, a group that has, kind of leanings toward Harvard or Yale, and these academics, in some cases, are referred to as scientists at the time, or people who have a background in psychology or sociology. Anthropology is a new field at this time. So this idea of scientific racism, that the, kind of gene pool is going to be affected. There is a belief in a sense, and people talk about this in like scientific terms, that everything about somebody's, kind of being is hereditary. So people are unchanging and everything is hereditary, and certain groups, are superior to other groups. And so we see a calling for criteria for removing undesirable immigrants. And the way in which to do this comes to be the literacy test, something that we know is also done to individuals in the South, free people of color after Reconstruction. Part of the Jim Crow South is also, kind of assessing voting rights based on a literacy test. So we get these very, suspect tools for measuring people's capability in a democracy. And so that's something to keep in mind. And this Immigration Restriction League, is quite popular and trendy amongst elite white Americans who harbor kind of an academic leaning, and it is seen as segueing with science. And so some of the hierarchy belief system of social Darwinism, eugenics, very embedded into some of the ideas of the Immigration Restriction League. Arguably, some of the proponents of this are more, focused on social Darwinism than others, but there is definitely a strain of that. And we see the Asiatic zone. This is a map that we looked at in class. This is a map that excludes the Philippines, but includes a good amount of the rest of Asia, and particular parts of China, with this sense that the United States has access or control to some of the places that are not in pink, but the places that are in pink, individuals from these spaces would be denied, and people are categorized and described. And I might have mentioned this in class, but groups of people from India, for example, are collectively referred to as Hindus, and ultimately, barred based on that particular categorization. So that's something to keep in mind. And some of these political cartoons, we talked about in class a little bit. This one is Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner by Thomas Nast. It has in the very middle kind of self-government and universal suffrage, a lot of representation of various groups of people, but yet, people are sitting at one table. And so there's a child and men and women at this table, and it is Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner. This is also a cartoon called Thanksgiving Dinner, one that has a lot more derogatory images. And so this is another one that you might want to take a look at. And then, there is a whole bunch of additional immigration legislation. We'll note the National Origins Act, which really kind of solidifies in 1921 and then also in 1924. This is an act which has a lot of the Immigration Restriction League attached to it. There's a commission in Congress called the Dillingham Commission that is working on the research that goes into this particular passage of this act. The National Origins Act will pass Congress and be in law until 1965, when immigration becomes much more open. Between 1924 and 1965, the National Origins Act will limit a great deal of immigrants, including, so it lowers the number of immigrants, but it also changes the basis of where people are allowed to come from. So there's caps placed on particular countries based on how many immigrants they had in the United States at an earlier period of time. And this period kind of shifts and changes as the law gets written. But if you kind of consider who was coming into the United States, for example, in 1880, and take a percentage of those immigrants, the number of immigrants as late as 1924 is a small percentage of the immigrants from 1880. And there's quite a few people excluded who were not in in high numbers in 1880, but became much more in high numbers in 1820 or whatnot. And so the National Origins Act and the Dillingham Commission really speak to very significant, nativist legislation, and some of that is also connected to our, our modern day discussion, right? Conversations about legislation that connects people to refugee status, for example. If people are excluded based on where they're from, then that becomes similar in a sense to the National Origins Act, right? And there's a lot of constitutional questions there, okay?